Hello and welcome to our presentation of our discussion paper about the influencing factors of local conflict journalism and its application for media development. My name is Viviane from the Ruhr University Bochum.
And I am Fabíola Ortiz from University Duisburg-Essen.
Our discussion paper today is especially based on our PhDs that are talking about radio stations in Burkina Faso and in the Central African Republic, CAR. And when we talk about local media and local journalists for this paper, we mean by that like journalists and media that are living and working in the conditions of the conflicts that they are covering. So first we will start a little bit with the role that media plays in peace and conflict transformation. Then we will discuss the 6 factors that are influencing conflict coverage according to Bläsi and expand on them. Then we will pose some critique and open questions to these factors. And at the end, we will finish with some recommendations for the media development sector. So the role of the media in peace and conflict transformation has also been described as constructive and proactive in peace building, especially through its ability to direct public attention to social conflict, social problems, and also the causes of conflict, and its potential to reduce and prevent violent conflict. The relationship between media and conflict in reality is but more subtle and ambiguous than the literature often suggests. And this paper, we want to consider some enabling and constraining factors that condition the journalist's daily work.
This paper introduces Bläsi's 6 factors that influence conflict coverage of international war reporters. He developed an empirically based model with a Western standpoint, associating aspects of audience, lobbies, context, structure, political climate, and personal influences that affect journalistic agency. We then discuss each factor transposing to what we call local journalism with examples from Burkina Faso and CAR. The audience factor. Important to consider audience not as a homogeneous entity, but audiences in plural. In CAR and Burkina Faso, violent conflict and insecurity situations affect the audience engagement in different ways. The audience's interaction and participation can be of social media, through SMS, call-in shows, or other different channels. We propose to look at habits, interests, and expectations of audiences, but also to employ a more participatory and intersectional perspective. And also here, armed groups are listening to that may lead to self-censorship from members of staff of the radios. The audience component is intertwined with lobby. Once media development organizations have their own agendas and views of how the conflict should be portrayed. The media has been used for publicizing certain interpretations. It directs our attention as well to power inequalities that influence processes of accessing information and reaching credible sources. This factor is closely related to the conflict, parties, military, national security, and political climate, public opinion, and hegemonic discourses. The personal factor. Journalists' personal characteristics are embedded in their web of relationships. For example, reporters living in the provinces in CAR tend to encounter difficulties in accessing specialized coaching and capacity building sessions due to these areas that are very hard to reach zones. Another example concerns women journalists in the rural Burkina Faso that have less access to training in comparison to male journalists residing in the capital, Ouagadougou. Those factors such as gender, location, religion, and ethnicity can influence a journalist's access to training opportunities. Also here, Bläsi puts more emphasis on competence that commonly implies diploma holders of formal education. Thus, more value should be put to practical experience. The role orientation and also the role performance should be considered, and they can partly be explained by the situation on site and the structural factors. The context. Journalists and families are exposed to the conflict. The situation on site factor includes logistics, security, access to information, and social ties, and even censorship. So questions such as do we no harm and be responsible while reporting and releasing information is truly important within a context. Media has become a target, a part of the conflict itself. The structural factor includes legal parameters, type of media, editorial, media economy, information flows, such as immediacy and time constraints. This factor is also limited by the context, such as curfew and restricted mobility that we can see in CAR. The political climate. So media appears as co-creating and reflecting public opinion. It is closely linked to the lobby factor as well. Involvement of different international actors that sometimes are not differentiated by society regarding the roles is very common, for example, in CAR. So here's some critiques and open questions. What is conflict coverage itself? Is it only news? Important to see factors as interlinked, interdependent. So the question remains, how do these interdependent factors influence the encoding and decoding processes as Hall used to speak of? How do they interplay when we consider local journalists reporting on conflict in areas where they live and work? How do they affect conflict coverage? So more empirical research is needed.
Another part of the critique and open questions is also linked to intersectional categories that are affecting also the work of journalists, as we saw. For example, gender, religious, location, class, ethnicity, age, and so on. Because these factors influence local journalists differently than foreign correspondents who are flying in to cover a faraway conflict. Clemencia Rodríguez, who did a lot of work in Colombia, also posed the question, whose responsibility is it actually to talk about violence, crimes, and corruption that could then impact negatively the radio staff and local journalists? Come now to some recommendations for the media development sector, and especially these 6 interdependent factors that Bläsi proposed can help to have a different view on planning, designing, coordinating projects in a more holistic and contextually based way. Now we go for each sector, some recommendations that we have. For the audience factor, we would recommend to invest into quality and disaggregated data, especially taking into account intersectional categories to understand the audience's communication needs. And based on this information, the media could provide then diverse, confidential, and accessible channels for the different audiences and the communities to participate and communicate with and through the radios. As we have heard before, non-state armed groups are often part of the audience of the listenership. It's very important to keep in mind this fact and to think about the consequences that it might have on the radio and the journalists. When it comes to the lobby factor, we would recommend to engage in a self-reflective practice to understand the organization's own positioning in the conflict, but also in the media landscape, and to think like how the project might impact the conflict coverage in the media that you're working with. And media development organizations are also political beings with their own normative groundings and agenda. For the personal factor, as we have said, Often conflict-related and journalistic competencies are linked to formal diploma and formal education. At the same time, acquired experience and practical experience should be valued at the same level as formal education. Moreover, it is to be sensitive and conscious about the societal pressures that are put on journalists that are working in conflict settings on their decisions and practices. For the situation on site, especially in violent conflict, it's very important to consider security risks and needs of everyone working in the project or in the media outlet. This includes volunteers, technicians, listener groups, and also local correspondents. On the structural factor, we highly recommend to foster more diverse newsrooms, also through promoting inclusive training opportunities, because having a diverse and professional staff is crucial to reinforce one's credibility and also to gain access to different sources of information, particularly in conflict settings. The political climate here as well, it's important to reflect on one's own position as an embedded actor within the context, and to see not only one's responsibility in informing people, but also in doing no harm. Be aware not to be instrumentalized in favor of one-sided narratives, but instead to provide spaces for alternative and counter-hegemonic discourses. Thank you so much for your attention.
And we look forward to the debate.